A tale from the modern era. The electrician was certainly no magician, yet he moved with the style of a surgeon who's made a decision. Clearly, he knew the risks of electrocution, but he wove his web of wires nonetheless, not unlike the master of a composition. Can you spell and define the words of our tale? If you have a notion, put it into action. The words are electrician, magician, decision, electrocution, composition. What segments or morphemes of these words share a common sound but are spelled differently? Think about this question as we begin today's session.
Hello and welcome to our story of morphemes. We hope that you enjoyed our rather rhythmic introduction to morphemes, to words, and to rhymes. In the course of today's session, we will show how rhymes are possible precisely because of the linguistic concept of morphemes. In fact, we will delve into the magic of morphemes and the power of these linguistic concepts to literally transform our students' understandings about and their capacity to spell even the most difficult words in our academic vocabulary in the classroom. Recent research in linguistics demonstrates that students of all ages have difficulty in spelling words. This is especially true when the sound of the word does not predict its spelling. Morphemes help our culturally and linguistically diverse, or CLD students, as well as our grade level students, with both spelling challenges and their vocabulary development. This is true because morphemes have a fixed spelling. More importantly, morphemes give an indication of the meaning of the words that are being read. In fact, morphemes enable students to understand and spell seemingly unpredictable words as if they were predictable, seemingly irregular words as if they were regular. Let's look at an example. The words confession and magician. They sound the same because they both end in shun. But as we see, they are spelled differently. Like magic, two morphemes can help students with each of these words. For example, to the morpheme confess, we can ask our students to simply add the morpheme ION. With the new word confession, the two morphemes that have built it have literally transformed the student's understanding of its meaning through the root morpheme confess, which many of our students know, as well as their capacity to spell it correctly by adding the morpheme suffix ION, which is teachable. So we can think of morphemes as units of meaning that have a fixed spelling in English. In fact, in our mission today, we're going to recognize the power of these morphemes to aid the CLD and our other grade level students in their comprehension and in their spelling of academic English at the elementary and at the secondary levels. We're also going to analyze the notion of words, how words contribute to language, how words are formed, and what it means to know a word. And finally, we're going to explore the morphology of effective teaching for second language acquisition. In the course of achieving today's mission, you'll want to keep in mind and check your understanding about key concepts. Many of the concepts that we'll discuss today are rather difficult concepts. Most of these will be discussed in the course of today's session. For others, you'll want to consult your session materials. The first of these concepts are morphemes. We'll also look at fixed spelling, affixes, prefixes, and suffixes. And then we'll examine grammar and grammatical morphemes, lexical morphemes, inflectional morphemes, derivational morphemes, and finally free and bound morphemes. Today we will also discuss analytic, synthetic, agglutinative, and polysynthetic languages. We'll talk about coining, compounding, clipping, borrowing, and blending words. We'll examine pragmatic information and what it can contribute for our culturally and linguistically diverse students. We'll look at various acronyms and the substance of these acronyms, including BICS, CALP, and CUP. And finally, we'll close with content and general academic vocabulary. As we've seen so far, morphemes have much to do with words. And perhaps more importantly, how we understand and how we spell those words has everything to do with morphemes. To help us better understand these relationships, please join me in welcoming Tani Martinez.
Thank you, Kevin. I'd like to begin our discussion, What is a Word?, by giving you a selection from Lewis Carroll's Jabberwocky. "'Twas brillig and the slithy toves did gyre and gimble in the wabe. All mimsy were the borogoves, and the mome wraths outgrabe." Do we understand what Lewis Carroll is telling us? Actually, as you look at the poem, you'll understand quite a bit about the poem, even though you don't understand it as a whole. For example, what do we know about toves? Well, we know that there are more than one of them, and that those mentioned here are slithy, whatever that is. We know that slithy describes the toves as either like a slith or having sliths. We know that these slithy toves gyred and gimbled, and even though we don't know what these actions are, we know they are actions and something about when they took place. How do we know all this, not knowing what any of the parts of the words mean? Well, the reason we know so much about the meaningless words in Carroll's poem is that some of the words and parts of the words are in fact English. The English words are small, and notice they are less prominent words, barely more prominent in their pronunciation than the parts of the words, the prefixes and the suffixes. Notice also that these small words and parts of words are expressions that tell us nothing about the selection as a whole, but only about the grammatical categories of the English language. Let's call them morphemes, just to have a term for them. A word is. No one has ever been able to define the word word, despite major efforts to do so. The linguistic concept of word, an analytic bibliography by Alphonse Juliand and Alexandra Rosaric, lists 118 pages of books and articles unsuccessfully attempting to define the word word over the past 3 millennia. Why can no one define the word word? Maybe because words simply do not exist. Rather, the sentences we speak are composed of morphemes. Morphology is the study of words. When writing language, usually each word is set off by a space. Would it really be hard to read someone's writing who... That's a difficult sentence to read, isn't it? Because there are no spaces in between the words, and reading the sentence quickly is nearly impossible. Yet, when speaking language, words can become even more difficult to define. At my house, the sentence, "Did you eat yet?" becomes, "Jeet yet?" How do we know whether a word is 1 word, 2 words, or 3 words? Is a contraction a word? Is the word merry-go-round 1 word or 3 words? To help us to begin to understand the morphology of words, let's turn to our colleague Christina Fanning. Now that we know what morphology is, let's take a look at how words are formed. Morphology, morphemes, you can make the connection. Let's take a look at some morphemes really quickly. Cat. Cat is a free morpheme because it can stand on its own, and it's also classified as a simple morpheme. Cats, when you add the S sound on the end, is a free morpheme plus a bound morpheme with the letter S because the S cannot stand alone with meaning. This also makes cats a complex morpheme. Wildcat is a free morpheme plus a free morpheme, which equals a compound morpheme. And wildcats is a free morpheme plus a free morpheme plus a bound morpheme, which equals a compound morpheme plus an inflectional morpheme. Whoa, I threw in a word there at the end that has absolutely no connection to what we were talking about, does it? Let's take a look at what inflectional morphemes might be. There's a lot of morphemes out there, so bear with me on this one. We've also got morphemes that are called affixes, which can be inflectional or derivational, prefixes and suffixes, lexical morphemes, and grammatical morphemes. Let's take a look at some of the affixes in the English language. Inflectional morphemes are always suffixes. They add to a word without changing the part of speech. Our example of cat and cats shows how the S is an inflectional morpheme. However, it's also important to recall that that S is also known as a bound morpheme. So you see that morphemes can carry numerous titles. English has 8 inflectional affixes. If you think about it, you can probably name all 8. A quick hint, 3 are added to nouns, 4 are added to verbs to show tense, and 2 are added to adjectives and adverbs to show comparison. If you're doing the math in your head, you might say to yourself, well, that equals 9. But there is one that applies to both nouns and verbs. A second type of affix is derivational. Now, derivational morphemes can be suffixes or prefixes, and they do change the meaning of a word. When a derivational is added to a base word, the meaning changes, but not necessarily the part of speech. Let's refer back to the original example of confess that Kevin shared with us. Confess is a verb that acts as a free morpheme. However, when you add the derivational ion or shun morpheme, you get the word confession, which is a noun. Meaning is changed along with the parts of speech. Now that you know inflectional and derivational morphemes, you also have an understanding of prefixes and suffixes and how they can affect a word. To clarify, let's take another look at our word wildcats. In this particular word, we saw that we had 2 free morphemes, wild and cat. And when you add the S, it does not change the part of speech, but adds the inflectional morpheme. 2 other types of morphemes are lexical and grammatical. It's important to just keep in mind that with lexical, the morphemes carry meaning, like our word cat. And in adding the S, which is an inflectional morpheme, and also a grammatical morpheme, because it shows a plural. Grammatical morphemes also show tense, but they do not carry individual meaning. Now that we have explored how words are formed, let's take a look at how this impacts types of languages. Types of languages involves classification by the way morphemes are combined. And there's 4 types that we're going to look at today. Analytic, where each word is one morpheme. Synthetic, where there are many inflections to words. Agglutinative, where there's many morphemes in one word.
And then polysynthetic. In polysynthetic languages, every word can be made of many morphemes, and sometimes they can represent an entire sentence. An example of an analytic language is Chinese. An example of a polysynthetic language is Navajo. In synthetic, agglutinative, and polysynthetic languages, each word carries more information, so the order of words is much less important. Japanese is a great example of an agglutinative language, and we are privileged to have with us today our colleague Miki Loschke, a native speaker of Japanese, to share further information.
こんにちは。カンザス州立大学のラシキミキです。In agglutinative languages such as Japanese, bound morphemes carry more case information than the word order as in English. ゆかが愛子の子供にその本をあげた。ゆかが愛の子供にその本をあげた。が is a subject marker followed by an indirect object marker ni and a direct object marker o in this sentence. This makes Yuka the giver, Ai's child the receiver, and sonohon the object being given. Yuka が愛の子供にその本をあげた。Yuka がその本を愛の子供にあげた。愛の子供にYuka がその本をあげた。愛の子供にその本をYuka があげた。その本を愛の子供にYuka があげた。その本を愛の子供にYuka があげた。Due to the free word order, except for the rigid verb final constraint in Japanese, the same message of X gives Y to Z can be expressed in as many as 6 different sentences that are all grammatical. Observe how the particles ga, ni, and o determine the case information regardless of the change in word order. Yuka が愛の子供にその本をあげた。Yuka がその本を愛の子供にあげた。Let's take a look at these two sentences. Observe the way the original word order X, Y, and Z in sentence 1 has to be changed in English to carry the same meaning in sentence 2, because word orders determine who gives what to whom. Whereas in Japanese, particles such as indirect object ni and direct object marker o determine meaning. You may not have a Japanese-speaking student in your classroom. However, language groups that share the same morphological typology include Korean, Turkish, Hungarian, Finnish, and so on. So your students whose L1 belongs to one of these languages may come up with different word orders that are not grammatical in English due to their L1 influence.
Thank you, Miki, for that insightful investigation of agglutinative language. I find it so interesting that in Japanese we are able to say the same sentence 6 different ways by using particles in different places in the sentence. When we're using the term particle, what we are also saying interchangeably is the use of a bound morpheme. So let's talk a little bit more about this. Why do we need to study grammar? Native speakers already have an instinctive sense of grammar. It is this knowledge which enables us to distinguish a well-formed English sentence from one which is clearly ill-formed. For example, native speakers know that the first sentence is well-formed and grammatical. David plays the piano. Native speakers can produce and understand a sentence like this without ever thinking about its grammar. Conversely, in the course of everyday communication, no native speaker would ever produce the second sentence, piano plays David the. We recognize instinctively that there is something very wrong with this sentence, not least because it doesn't make sense. It is ill-formed and ungrammatical. Now, if all of this is true, then it is reasonable to ask why we need to study grammar at all. If we know instinctively that 1 is correct and 2 is nonsense, then why would we ever need to study grammar? Well, let's look at the historical aspects of studying grammar. You probably remember identifying the parts of speech. Remember, find all the nouns in the worksheet and circle them. At one time, school was conducted in Latin. When English became the language of instruction, many teachers found themselves with nothing to teach. The children already knew English, so they didn't need to learn the language of school. We get the term grammar school because that is where grammar was taught. However, these former Latin teachers began to apply the Latin categories to the English language. We have remnants of Latin today. Many of our words have Latin roots, even though English is a Germanic language. We get a lot of our grammar rules, such as do not end a sentence with a preposition, as a remnant of that Latin learning. We also have English words that were fitting into Latin categories. These Latin categories include that nouns are defined by what they are, names of people, places, things, or ideas. Adjectives are defined by what they do, modifying a noun. Conjunctions connect parts of sentences. Each part of speech is defined differently, which can really make students struggle as they are having to construct new languages from words they're learning. The study of grammar enables us to go beyond our instinctive native speaker knowledge and to use English in an intelligent, informed way. But does knowing the parts of speech make students better readers or writers? According to Stephen Krashen, the answer is no. A number of studies over the last 100 years have confirmed that the implicit study of grammar does not contribute to writing quality, but extensive reading does. Those who read more write better, spell better, and have better control of grammar constructions. However, there can be good reasons for studying grammar, which helps us in the editing process of writing. And even those who read a lot may have gaps, such as in when to use words such as lie and lay. Without terms like noun and verb, it would be impossible to talk about the words in our language. We need a common vocabulary. A foreign language can be acquired more efficiently by studying the grammar of one's own native language. All languages and all dialects follow grammatical patterns. All languages evolve, and all languages adopt new words. In order to enlighten us a little bit more on the idea of new words in our lexicon, let's go back to our colleague Christina Fanning to find out more about this concept.
Now that we know that words in all languages evolve and make all these changes, let's take a look at how new words enter a language. Let's take a look at some English words. What are the origins of these words? Shrek, fat, cyclone, and chipmunk. Shrek. Most of us associate this proper noun as a character from a very popular movie, A large green ogre, right? Fat. Now, fat, back when I was younger, was a pretty derogatory term. The way that it's spelled here maybe is better associated with a younger crowd, but its meaning as an adjective is pretty well known. If something is fat, it is not large, but cool. It's also part of a name of a really fabulous clothing line that we have in our popular culture today. Cyclone. Most of us might associate this as a noun that is synonymous with tornado or twister. However, it has also entered the English language as a cool, frosty ice cream treat, usually mixed with bits of candy. It is still a noun, but it carries two different meanings. And chipmunk, lovable little rodent-like creatures. But did you know that the origins of this word are actually from the Native Americans? When the colonists encountered unfamiliar wildlife, fauna, or food, they would borrow the Native American terms and spell them phonetically in English. We also have loan words from the Native Americans, such as skunk, teepee, and something that is as fun to say as it is to eat, succotash. So how do we get these new words? There are technical terms associated with this. Some of these terms are coining, compounding, clipping, creating acronyms, blending, back formation, and borrowing. Coining. I think that we're all familiar with the term, you coin a phrase. That's exactly what coining is. Compounding. New words are created by joining existing words. Almost any part of speech can be joined with another, and this is compounding to form a new word. Clipping and acronyms are abbreviated forms of words. For example, most universities have acronyms associated with them. KSU is the acronym for Kansas State University. Blending is when two words are combined to create one new word, usually by deleting a few letters here and there. A great example comes from Hollywood and taking two very famous and fabulous star names and combining them to make one name for the two people. Back formation actually gives us some new words, and in English we regularly create verbs from nouns. Have you ever told someone to Google a topic? Is Yahoo used to express excitement, or is it a place name? Borrowed words. English is full of borrowed words, which makes our vocabulary huge. And these words are used on a pretty regular basis. Some borrowed words that would be expected would be food names. For example, do you say sauerkraut, or would you say shredded cabbage that has been brined? It's much easier to say sauerkraut. Then there are the unexpected words such as robot, which comes to us from the Czechs, and one of my very favorites, shampoo, which we have on loan from the Hindi language. Now, in creating all of these new words, there are some rules that go along with it. Derivational affixes, and we talked about those earlier, make up most of our new words. And remember that these can be prefixes or suffixes. And new words typically follow a pattern when they don't fall into the previous categories we discussed. But as with anything, there are still some exceptions to the rules. Let's take a look, now that we know how new words are formed, let's look at some different views of reading back to our colleague Tani.
Thank you, Christina, for those fabulous examples about how words enter our language. And as our teachers are watching this, I can imagine that all of them have examples of words that are now part of their students' vocabulary that definitely were not parts of their vocabularies as students. As we're discussing vocabulary, let's continue with our examination of how teachers use vocabulary in their teaching. There are two views as we look at reading and vocabulary. One is a word recognition view, wherein we're going to pre-teach vocabulary that we think our students may not know. The second view is the socio-psycholinguistic view. As we've broken those words apart and are thinking about each of the elements of that word, those are the areas of the language that we want to appeal to, and the areas of the biography of the student that we want to appeal to as we're attempting to make that content comprehensible for them. In this view, we want to build background knowledge for reading and engage students in extensive reading for acquiring words in context. So the difference in the two views would be that there has to be more than finding a dictionary definition of words and then writing them in a sentence, which would lean more towards the word recognition view. The definitions students use aren't always the right ones, and the sentences the students write may not reflect an understanding of the word. It's much more important for us to give the students the opportunity to experience the word. That's what builds that comprehensible input. And the student will say, the more I experience a word, the more I understand it. I'd like to give you a little example of the word recognition view from my own professional practice. We were sliding through an essay done by a Kansas student, and we ran across the word hailstones. This word became a label for something, and what we want to make sure that we don't do is the danger of students learning a label without fully understanding the concept. For example, that word hailstones. As I read the essay, all of a sudden, all of the kids started looking up. And for some of my second language learners, that confused look told me that they had recognized a word that they didn't know. So I said, okay, let's look at this word, hailstones. And one of the kids says, well, is that one word or two words? The next student said, when I looked at that word, I saw hailstone. Hailstones. And another student looked at me and said, Mrs. Martinez, I saw it and I thought hailstone. Each of these children were attacking this word in a very different way. So it was very important for me to take that teachable moment, to stop the action, and make sure that we experience that word. The closest thing that I could find and was running next door to the teacher's lounge and grabbing ice cubes. And we held the ice cubes in their hands and talked about hailstones. That made the children realize so much more about the essay, so much more about what can happen in Kansas, and so much more about the word recognition than just hailstones. I encourage you to make sure that you are allowing your students, as they're attacking new words, to experience those words, to make that comprehension happen. How are some more ways that we can do that? Well, let's have fun with words by allowing our students multiple opportunities to experience words. Here are 4 ways. When it's time to line up for music, for gym, for art, let's have our students take their places in line by saying an adjective that begins with the same letter as their name. For example, in our game we could say tired Tawny or terrific Tawny, but what we have is another way of practicing our adjectives. In PE, instead of capturing the flag, how about laminating some of the vocab words? And as the kids capture those words, they get to keep them if they can define them and use them in a sentence for the teacher. For Lunch and Learn, I challenge you to eat lunch with one of your CLD students. Have the student teach you in his or her first language, the names of the foods you are eating, and in turn, teach him or her the English words or other words that stand for the food. Do the same with color words, number words, and the names of the things you see in the cafeteria. Time for one-on-one conversations like this help you get to know the child, build his or her confidence, and develop both of your vocabularies. Finally, tickets out. The way you can utilize vocabulary for tickets out is to take the vocabulary words, put them on sticky notes, and place them in the classroom. Then, when it's time for the students to leave, make sure before they go home for the day, they grab one of those, come up and tell you what the word means, perhaps the part of speech it is, and even what it might be in their language. The point that I want to make is having fun with words can mean multiple opportunities to experience and work with words. As we continue talking about words and morphology, let's go back to Christina for some additional concepts on this topic.
Thank you, Tani, for those fabulous examples. You can just imagine the size of the vocabulary a student needs to master in accomplishing even those fun tasks. What about the size of the vocabulary? This is really difficult, even for the most incredible linguists in the world, to determine because, well, what defines a word? Let's go back and look at some of our previous examples. Is cat an entirely different word than cats? Or when I say the word fabulous and I clip it to become fab, are those two entirely different words? Or do we just go by the words that we find in a dictionary? Just open it up and start counting the words. So what does it mean to actually know words? There's actually 5 different elements of information that we need to consider. Phonological information, morphological information, syntactic information, semantic information, and pragmatic information. So what does it mean to know words? Phonologically, a word can be in your reading and writing vocabulary, but you may not be able to pronounce it perfectly. For example, I know the word agglutinative, but phonologically, I have difficulty saying the word. Morphological. In this case, knowing a word means knowing what affixes do to the word. In syntactic information, also knowing a word means knowing how it functions within a sentence. Semantic information means knowing a word, not only being able to define it, but also having an understanding of the deeper meaning as the word is stated. It also involves knowing how a word is related to similar words. A general term like tree is associated with more specific names such as oak, fir, and pine, but also with the classifications of trees such as conifers and angiosperms. Pragmatic information. This refers to the real-world use of a term. When you take all of these elements into consideration, you can clearly see that having a student find a word in the dictionary would not necessarily constitute comprehension or knowledge of that word. Let's take a look at the development of second language acquisition from a morphology standpoint. We've talked about Krashen's natural order hypothesis, and this is based on the study of morphemes. We also need to talk about the development of academic vocabulary, and this is gaining a richer understanding of morphology that leads to a more capable educator in helping CLD students develop academic vocabulary. In Krashen's natural order hypothesis, it's important to remember that it is based on morphemes. If you are teaching outside of the natural learning context, you may see some instant results. However, remember that this direct teaching doesn't necessarily change the order of morphemic acquisition. There is more information provided to you in your materials on this topic. In discussing academic language, it's important to keep in mind Cubbon's terms BICS and CALP. BICS, if you can recall, is basic interpersonal communication skills, and CALP is the cognitive academic language proficiency. We know how critical academic language is for our CLD students, and this process can take up to 5 years to acquire that CALP. Many students may appear to speak and understand, but still struggle with academic texts. With better morphological direction in the classroom, their academic vocabulary will be improved. Let's return now to Kevin, who will discuss the development of academic English in greater depth.
Thank you, Christina. As each of us have tried to convey today, words, despite the fact that they are among the simplest components of our language, carry a number of meanings and connotations that we want to keep in mind, including phonological implications, semantic connotations, and syntactic implications. And so, as we think about academic vocabulary, we see that the words of these vocabularies are that much more difficult for many of our students, especially those students who are culturally and linguistically diverse. Beyond that, we also have two sorts of academic vocabulary that we should be aware of as educators. As we see in this table, we have content-specific academic vocabulary and we have general academic vocabulary. Let me talk about the first for a moment. Content-specific academic vocabulary involves those technical words in each of the various subject areas. For example, in the subject area of biology, we might talk about technical terms such as a cell, or a nucleus, or the mitochondria. What we find is that linguistic research shows us, and this is very recent research, that this content-specific academic vocabulary is actually acquired rather rapidly. And this occurs despite the fact that the words of this vocabulary tend to be relatively infrequent in texts. What this research demonstrates is that these words are actually more salient to students. Now, why might this be? Well, the research finds that these words are more often directly connected to the topic of lessons in the classroom. These words are more often bolded, italicized, or otherwise enhanced in the text that students read. And these words are also more recurrently tested by teachers as they focus on topics to be learned by the students. On the other hand, we can talk about a general academic vocabulary. This type of vocabulary is what we might call cross-disciplinary, because the words of this vocabulary are used in many different subject areas and might include words such as regulate, feature, illustrate, or strategy. Linguistic research on this type of vocabulary reveals that the words of this vocabulary are actually acquired more slowly than content-specific words. And this occurs despite the fact that these words are less frequent in texts. Again, the reason is that these words are in fact less salient to students. Among the reasons that account for this are the fact that these words of the general academic vocabulary are not necessarily related to topics in direct ways in the classroom. These words are less often enhanced through italicization or underlining or whatever in the text. And these words are seldom assessed by teachers as part of content area assessments. So we find that a general academic vocabulary is actually more valuable to culturally and linguistically diverse and grade level students because it is useful to comprehension across disciplines, across subject areas. Yet in texts and in classrooms, it is less often understood by students. It's less explicitly taught by their teachers, and it is less frequently assessed in the sorts of testing and assessments that we see in the classroom. Students, especially those whose language is not English, whose first language is not English, need a broader range of learning experiences with this vocabulary. They need experiences that are also authentically assessed to assure students' comprehension. One way to achieve these objectives is through cognates. Cognates are words that tend to be comprehensible across languages. For example, we might talk about such words across the English and Spanish languages. Some examples would be the English word balance and the Spanish cognate balancia, the English word colonial and the Spanish cognate colonial, the English word geography and the Spanish word geografía. So why do cognates work? Well, for CLD students, especially those whose first language is not English, concepts, skills, and linguistic knowledge that are learned in the first language transfer to language acquisition and content learning in the second language. And this occurs according to what Jim Cummins refers to as Common Underlying Proficiency, or CUP. So although the first and second languages of students may appear quite different on the surface, the student uses this common underlying proficiency to draw upon and uses his academic and his linguistic knowledge in the first language to comprehend both new words and new concepts in the second language. Cognates capitalize upon this capacity because what also transfers across languages is vocabulary knowledge. So if we think of words as labels for concepts, and the two words of cognates are similar, then the student can utilize one to connect with what he or she already knows in the other. For example, if the Spanish dominant student already knows the concept of diagrama in the first language, he is often able to recognize the English word diagram as a new label for the concept that he already knows. Now, through such connections, students can rapidly expand their English academic vocabulary. So let's recap. A general academic vocabulary is critical to CLD and grade level students because such a vocabulary is cross-disciplinary. That is, the words of this vocabulary can be utilized across subject areas. Yet this vocabulary is not often an emphasis of text, it's seldom taught explicitly, and it is not always assessed. Therefore, this type of vocabulary is sometimes poorly understood by our students. Cognates serve as one way to teach general academic vocabulary to CLD students whose first language is not English. And this is because cognates are words that are comprehensible across languages. They are words that prompt linguistic and concept transfer across these languages. And they do so through common underlying proficiency. As we bring this session to closure, I'm reminded of our session title, Morphemes, Magic, and Metamorphosis. As we've discussed today, morphemes are at the heart of words. They are at the heart of how words form a language and how words convey both context and meaning in our linguistic communications. Yet we have also discovered in today's session that a knowledge of, and especially a knowledge of how to use morphemes, can almost magically transform the capacities of our CLD and other students to understand the meaning of words, to spell the words correctly, and to build the content-specific and general academic vocabularies that they will need to comprehend increasingly complex subject area texts and instruction. Isn't it about time for some new magic in your classroom, your venue of professional practice? Whether you're an elementary or a secondary educator, think about the transformations, the metamorphosis in student understanding that are possible through morphemes. It's no illusion, morphemes can work magic. Thanks for joining us and enjoy a great day.
would like to share some video excerpts to demonstrate some of the concepts brought forth throughout this session. In the first clip, you will see a teacher demonstrating some of the concepts that Christina covered. From a linguistic perspective, knowing a word involves having phonological, morphological, syntactic, semantic, and pragmatic information. As you view the clip, see if you can discover which types of information the teacher is reinforcing through her table time with her students.
Okay, we're going to work today on hearing the sound, the S. Can you guys all say S sound at the end of words? So I'm going to say these words up here. These are words that are in the story or in the book that we're reading. And I'm going to say these, and I want you to say them after me. Okay? Plants.
Plants.
Good. And I hear you guys all doing the S at the end. So plants. One more time.
Plants.
Twigs.
Twigs.
Buds.
Buds.
Bits.
Bits.
And those mean little pieces. So these are, this would be like bits of bark, little pieces. Rabbits,
Rabbits.
animals,
Animals.
and trees.
Trees.
Good. And so what do all these words have in common? What do you notice about every one of these words?
Have.
I want you to talk to each other and see if you can kind of all agree.
Same.
Talk to them.
It's the same because the S is when it finish have the S.
What do you guys think? There's the S sound. What were you going to say?
They sound like same, but all have different sound and different letters.
They have different letters, but they all have one thing
S.
the same. They have S at the end. And these are all nouns, so they're all things that you can see. A noun. Have you guys heard that word before? Noun. Noun. Yeah. So these are all nouns. And when you put the S at the end in English, it makes it more than one. So rabbits, it's not one rabbit, it is two rabbits. Or it's the same in Spanish. Usually you'll add an S, like conejo, conejos would be two rabbits. How do you say rabbits in Burmese?
Rabbits. Rabbit. Yo.
What is it?
Yo.
Yo? Is that rabbit? Is that more than one rabbit? How would you say one rabbit?
One rabbit.
Uh-huh.
Yo.
And how would you say two rabbits? Remember?
Nakuyo.
What is it?
Nakuyo.
Nakuyo. So yo is one rabbit and nakuyo is two rabbits. Interesting. So you notice in Burmese, you don't add the S, do you?
Yeah.
So you don't add an S to the end like English. When you say it in English too, you want to be sure that you pronounce it. So you have to hear that S and say that S. Whenever you read it, you want to be able to pronounce it. And you're real conscious of that when you're reading. We're going to go ahead and read we're just going to read page 24.
In the next classroom we will be visiting, keep in mind what you have learned about the word recognition view and the socio-psycholinguistic view that relates to a morphological approach to vocabulary. Do you remember the difference? In the word recognition view, teachers pre-teach vocabulary that they think the students may not know. In the socio-psycholinguistic view, teachers recognize the importance of building background knowledge for reading and engage students in extensive reading so they can acquire word meanings as they encounter words in context. Please view the second teacher in action and decide which view is presented. There will be questions about both clips to follow.
Write down a few words that you think might be key and might be important for you to understand the material that's in Chapter 9. And where might we look to find keywords? Okay, there's a list of vocabulary at the very beginning of the chapter. That'd be a great place to start. Where else would you find keywords? Dustin, where might you find some keywords? What might be some important words? As you're looking through Chapter 9 there, Dustin, how would you identify a word that might be important? Bold. Yeah, if it's in bold, it's probably going to be an important word. Very good. Where else might you look to find a key word? The headings. Good. The headings of the different sections are going to give you clues as to where you might find a keyword. So just take a moment by yourself, skim through that chapter, look for some words that are in bold, look for some words that are in the headings, look for some of those words that are in that vocabulary list at the beginning of the chapter. Just write down a few words that are going to be key. And what we're going to do is we're going to put these together and form a really big class list of vocabulary words. Right here, you guys got a word?
Energy.
Energy. The fact that a keyword is important, does that mean that it has to be a word that we haven't heard about before? Huh? Do you think that if it's a word you've heard before, that means it's not important? No. Yeah, to say that would be incorrect. In fact, energy is going to be the most important word in Chapter 9. That's a really good one. And the fact that we've probably heard about energy before doesn't make it any less important. You're going to learn things about energy that you probably never thought of before. Good. You guys got it? One word.
ATP.
ATP. Very good. Guys in the back.
ADP.
ADP. What do you think about ATP and ADP? Do you think they're maybe related somehow? Yeah, that'd be a good hypothesis. The back. Photosynthesis. Have we ever heard of photosynthesis before? Probably. That doesn't make it any less important, though. We're going to talk about it again. We're going to learn a little more about it. It's a contextual redefinition. I've changed it around a little bit, tried to make it a little more user-friendly. But there is room on there for 10 words. I want you to pick, either from our list or if there's some on your own personal list that we didn't write on the board, that's fine. But I want you to pick 10 words. I'm going to say a couple things. I wouldn't worry a whole lot about NADP. Okay, it's great, it's really important, but we're not going to go quite that in depth. Light-dependent, light-independent reactions, these are great, but again, there's a few things up there that I think you'd maybe be a little better served focusing on. We're not going to go quite that in depth. So those are just a few that I'd point out that maybe those wouldn't be the best ones to include on here. If you want to do them, by all means, you're welcome to. If you really want to know what NADP is, by all means, study up. What you're going to do is you're going to write your 10 words down the right-hand side or the left-hand side, what you think it means. And then the third column, this is we tend to do this one wrong. The third column is context. Folks, I want a sentence in there out of the book that includes that word. Meaning the sentence that you write in context, if your word is lactic acid, your sentence should include what?
Lactic acid.
Lactic acid. we've been kind of getting lazy with that. I want to see you write the whole sentence. It includes that word. Fourth column is what you think it means after reading about it, after seeing it in the context of the textbook. And then obviously your final column is for your textbook definition. Easiest place to find the textbook definition is where? In a glossary. Please make sure at the top of this paper you put your name and what class this is. Also make sure under reading assignment, this is chapter 9. Make sure you put that there so you can keep this separate from the other ones.